Thanks, Matt. And welcome back, everyone. For those of you that listen to Matt, hello again. And those that popped off to get a cup of tea, welcome back. From all things internet with Vint and Ed to tech reg to IoT, and our next session is Sex in Public, a panel exploring how sex, a deeply personal act, is navigated in the very shared public sexual space of the internet. We ask the question, who gets to speak and who gets to be said? I'm going to pass on to our moderator, Rachel Dixon, long-time digital expert and well-recognised contributor to Australia's internet. Rachel is currently the Victorian Privacy and Data Deputy Commissioner, and she'll introduce the topic further along with our speakers. So a warm welcome to Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Look, I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. I think my office has become aware over the years of some of the unfortunate consequences of policies that perhaps have unintended consequences. And while this session has I guess, a fairly provocative title, I think there's some really profound issues around what the balance is between, the protection of minority rights versus the protection of other people, the right to freedom of expression versus protection of young people. And none of this is easy, but I'm very fortunate to be joined by people with some, deep knowledge of some of the implications of some of this. Eve X and Sai Jaidan Lilith have both got extensive backgrounds in the sorts of areas that we're going to be discussing today. I think Eve does a very good job as a provocateur, but it's informed by some deep knowledge, some sociology, and some knowledge as an educator. So I'd like to I won't go into the details, the full details of their bios, because I imagine you've all probably read those on the actual website. But I would like to turn over to Eve now, and to get her to, before I do, by the way, I should have done the welcome to country. I'm actually on Wurundjeri land, the Kulin Nation. But I just wanted to acknowledge their elders. My apologies for not doing this properly in the first place. I'd like to turn over to Eve just to make a few statements. Before I do, for those of you who are not familiar with things like the US legislation like FOSTA, and things like that, I think some of these are the things that we'll keep in mind as this presentation goes on. Eve, if you're available, could you come on, please?
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, for such a lovely introduction. I feel quite shocked. Thank you to all the attendees for coming, and thank you to NetThing for organising this amazing event. I am a sex worker, an artist, an educator. I come from an academic background. I'm interested in a lot of different things, the big picture, really. So today we're talking about sexuality. That's been the world I've been immersed in for the last 7 years now in various different aspects. And I'm joined by my beautiful partner, Sai Jaidan Lilith.
Hi, I'm Sai Jaidan Lilith. I'm also a sex worker, musician, Shibari performer. We have a ritual theatre company together.
We have a child.
We have a child. Yeah, I've been working in the industry in various forms for about 6 years now, from one-on-one sessions as an escort dominatrix, creating content, running public events for people, engaging in education, and speaking in panels like this. So thank you very much. We are sharing a screen and camera as for bandwidth purposes, and I just had not figured out how to change the name on it. So we are EVEX, apparently. Yeah, thank you for having us on.
Thank you. Could I just kick off, I guess, by talking about, when we talk about sex, I know we'll get onto topics like big data and things like that a little bit later on, but perhaps you could begin by talking about, the kind of the issues around who gets to speak about these kinds of issues, and what the consequences are of getting this wrong.
Thank you, Rachel. So I guess to begin, we're both sex workers, but we're really here as sex educators in a broader sense. So we're approaching this more from a human rights angle. I mean, we believe in freedom of expression. We believe in freedom of religious expression as well, which is tied into sexuality. We believe in education, access to reproductive information. So there's a lot of things nestled into this that aren't in our particular domain that are very much related to what, as sex workers, we go through. So I'd like to start by offering a little bit of history and context about our contemporary social sexual fabric and how that has developed to be what it is. Sex it's a universal human experience, whether we have it or not, we come from it. It's everywhere. The birds and the bees, it's how this world survives. This culture, this living world. All individual cultures on this world have had amazing traditions of dealing with sexuality and weaving those into spirituality as well, into politics. With the advent of globalization, we saw Western Christian attitudes proliferating across the globe and influencing these cultures. We see a lot of syncretic religions that are fusions of Christianity with other things. One of the things with this is that sex is fairly rarely considered to be something positive within this Christian framework. It's often shameful. It's often only acceptable in the name of reproduction. Knowledge is sin. There are exceptions to this, but as a general thing, Christianity is not a very welcoming space for diverse sexualities. Non-normative sexualities are either not represented or they're actively denounced. The gender binary is rigid and hierarchical. There's not a lot of room to move and explore. We still see sex everywhere around us, but it's generally replicating these heteronormative sort of patriarchal codes of masculinity and femininity. So we're going to start with a quote from the Sex Positive Media Social Media Manifesto. It's something we'll be referring to a couple of times throughout this talk. It's quite a recent thing. I'm going to throw to Sai to explain a little bit more.
Thank you. So, what we're covering right now is basically the decolonization of sex online. And there's been some great work done here by the Sex Positive Social Media Manifesto. You can look it up online. It's a publicly available document. I'd like to thank everyone that contributed to it. And the particular quote here is, "Sexuality is generally organized into systems of power that reward narrow forms of intimacy such as marriage, monogamy, procreation, coupledom, and private sex, and punish other forms of intimacy such as public sexuality, queer sexualities, commercial sex, and kink. These systems disadvantage and marginalize some sexual communities and privilege others, perpetuating inequalities." So that's a quote. And our philosophy is that the individual right to interact with sex consensually should be respected. And we can create a better, more inclusive collective social sexual consciousness.
So dropping into a little bit more background about how this has occurred more recently. From mid-20th centuries, we saw a lot of changes in how we were talking about sex in public spaces and gender as well. This accelerated with the advent of the internet, which allowed individuals access to spaces outside established social structures where they could find kinship. We see so many more publicly visible sexualities now, and that's quite scary to some people. For those who have had their sexualities historically stigmatized, it's wonderful to find community and to see others, to drop that feeling of being alone. But there are others who feel that public displays of sexuality are a violation, an intrusion into their own safe space. So we need to find an agreed space or some agreed spaces of public sexuality so that everyone has access to this feeling of safety. So we believe the right and need for sexual education and artistry is something that needs to be defended as a good, because education is what combats fear that's based in ignorance. So we're going to move on to the very specific way these policies are starting, like these ideologies are playing out through policy. So the current flavor is very much based on US values, legislation, and policy. Internal US policy is affecting what every global citizen is able to access. So we need to be talking about how to both honor a global accessible shared space and also state sovereignty. So even bringing in state sovereignty is opening up the gate to censorship. Again, sex is a canary for censorship. Most of us have feelings about what's appropriate or not, and so these edges are really easy to erode. I think that the UN Charter of Human Rights is a key touchstone. We already have an international framework for negotiating international issues. It's something that holds human rights as its key focus. So in terms of navigating these spaces, we need to be looking at the UN and how rigorously we're engaging with that existing framework.
Can you just talk a little bit, just for a moment then? I mean, the early days of the internet, obviously, people were encouraged by the idea that it was all one planet and everybody's going to be able to communicate, and it was all very empowering. And there's obviously been a shift over the past couple of decades. And you've mentioned now, obviously, the US dominance in terms of what the internet is culturally. What impacts does that have now? You mentioned state sovereignty. I think there's probably a lot of people in the internet field, and certainly a lot of people in this particular event today, who would still hold to that original view that the internet is an empowering thing. Can you talk a little bit about, well, okay, if we get to this state sovereignty thing coming in, what's the impact of that?
Well, there's been a very real example of that, and it does it's funny because we're seeing the physical colonization patterns play out online. So we've got a global hegemony, i.e. the US, dictating to other states and other countries like how the internet, this global space, is going to operate, basically, because they're holding the structures, they're holding the networks and the frameworks that hold the rest of the internet. So very specifically, you brought Foster Sester and how that affects our online experience. So I've spoken a lot about this in the past, and I'm going to give a really quick summary of it because I could go on for a while. Foster Sester was a bill that was originally brought in the US to combat sex trafficking. What it did in effect was to change Section 230 of their act, which basically gave protections to websites as a third-party host against content that was hosted on their website. So before, they weren't directly culpable for anything that was posted on the site because that was an individual's responsibility. But now, because they were trying to combat sex trafficking and saying, well, now you're responsible, so you can be held liable for anything that goes on your website. And this was done, in a supposed a spirit of goodwill and to help, but it's actually created an immense amount of harm, because what it's meant is that platforms have become increasingly heavy-handed in just censoring and removing anything that might relate to sex trafficking, which just means any mention of sex at all. Because they're now liable, big companies do what they do best and protect themselves, and they've created an environment where, not only sex workers have had their safe spaces and voices and places of work basically stripped away with little or no warning, but that's flowed onto social media, where educators and sex therapists and discussion groups, people like survivor groups on sexual trauma, they're all being affected basically and silenced because of this law. I
had heard that certainly for US sex workers, that it was effectively driving the advertising of their services off the internet entirely, or at least off the major platforms where people previously where they've been able to advertise, and that was reducing the safety for those sex workers because it was driving them into back to the street really, or back to environments where they did not have the protections that they'd previously had, where they could check on people before they went to work and that sort of stuff. So it's clear that that kind of well-meaning legislation, and I don't know that I don't know whether or not the legislators who originally proposed the act actually had this outcome in mind. I think it was designed to stop sex trafficking. It has not necessarily done that. It's had a completely different effect.
Yeah, I just quickly interject. The law has been used approximately 4 times since its inception. So the actual law itself has been used only 4 times, but the effects of it being there are actually constant.
Yeah. Okay. So this comes to the issue then, I guess, of inadvertent censorship, which I guess, getting back to your earlier comments about there being a kind of a switch to the morality of the internet, if you like, and I think we can certainly see that in proposals in Australia, where there's the idea that there's a natural order in society that needs to be reinforced on the internet, rather than the diversity kind of argument that was made 20, 30 years ago. Do you want to talk about how that impacts then on the idea of safe spaces, on the idea of what you can do online, what you can't do online?
Yeah, so I guess there's a very particular thing that I would like to speak of that's probably nested a sentence or two ago about this position of who gets to decide what gets spoken about what is the acceptable social conversation. And I guess until the internet, we had a more rigorous process of curation in place for public spaces, for the information that was disseminated. People could spread stories amongst themselves, but there were understood processes, and there was an respect for expertise that we sort of have lost a little bit with the internet in some ways. I mean, everyone has access to a huge amount of information, so we have the general public becoming more informed in all sorts of different ways, but that has also eaten into the traditional respect for people who are deeply established in their knowledge base and have deeply valuable contributions to society based in that intense knowledge. So I think, there is this question of this is a role of curation, and who do we want to be curating the public experience? And I think we don't, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that currently we have US government, social media companies and banking companies deciding that conversation, curating that conversation for us.
Yes, I guess I didn't touch on that, but you're absolutely right in terms of payment providers and things like that being another way.
A little bit later, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So just to sort of finish up this bit about decolonization of sexuality. So with decolonization of sexuality, we're acknowledging that different cultures have unique sexual traditions, but also different bodies. So we're talking about non-white bodies, women's bodies, transgender bodies, disabled bodies, and how those people find a space of both information and expression. So decolonizing sex is about, honoring the various ways of human expression, sexuality being expressed within the dictate of no harm. And that should really be the primary guideline of all of this, is harm, no harm, but also where are we applying way too many regulations around this? This is the liberal question at this point, I think. Yeah.
You've sort of, I want to come back to the big data piece a little later, but the logical thing, of course, that you were going to talk about a little bit is the Helen Lovejoy piece, but won't somebody think of the children? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because obviously a lot of the policies that are put in place by some of these companies or the legislation that's being put in place in Australia and overseas is designed, to protect the children. And I'm sure Helen Lovejoy would have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, so, what about the children? But what about the children? It's the argument that's used so much to actually like strangle a lot of things online with, a supposed like, with a desired good outcome. They're coming across as like, we're doing this thing to protect people. It's very logical. These are steps that we're going to take.
We're protecting children from harm, but we're also, we're by protecting them from harm, we're also not necessarily giving them skills to navigate that in the real world.
Yeah, and I feel like it's basically operating from a flawed premise. It's a bunch of logical steps, but the premise of it is that sex is inherently harmful. Like that's where it comes from. That's where the online safety bill was born, is that, children need to be protected. Sex is inherently harmful. Therefore, they need to be protected from harm. We can all agree that children need to be protected from harm, and sex is harmful.
It's dirty and shameful, and has nasty feelings attached to it.
Yeah.
And by saying this argument, we're reinforcing it out into the world as well.
I recall the statements by a former Australian senator who was basically making the argument that if you weren't in favour of certain forms of regulation, that you were essentially protecting pedophiles. And I believe he said that on several occasions. So we can see that this argument is I guess, easy to wield and hard to defend against.
Yeah, it's intensely alarmist, and yeah, as if you argue against this, you're a monster. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. But we need to acknowledge that children are curious; they explore. So this exploration is how they're encountering sexuality, how they're learning about it. It's critical not just for biology, but for safety. I mean, consent is a critical skill that should be taught at a young age. And it's not just critical for navigating sexuality, but for navigating all of our interactions with the world. So understanding one's own biology, bodily autonomy, consent, boundaries, it's all about sexual development, but it's all about just, being able to be in the world, both online spaces and in the world in safety.
So I know that, for government agencies, for people developing policy in this area, what works from an allyship kind of point of view? I do recall some years ago, my office had a presentation by some LGBTIQ groups about the ways in which privacy legislation, for example, had an impact on their lives, and even just the design of forms and things like that could get quite complicated and constraining. Do you want to talk about the allyship thing a bit?
Yeah, so I guess this particular conversation, we have quite a expansionist view of what the sex industry or people working with sexuality actually looks like. So for us, this is more of a call-in of people who are affiliated with sexuality in some form, either in their work or just like, they're passionate about it in their day-to-day life, to actively engage with this. So I guess we do have a list of the groups that we feel like, quite an extended list of groups who are affected and ways in which they can engage.
Yeah, so this, the drive to create like safe spaces online, and the unintended consequences of this from legislators does affect, it seems obvious that it affects sex workers, escorts, full service sex workers, BDSM practitioners, but also it doesn't just affect them, it affects the support groups and services associated with the work. So, safe spaces where, workers can gather and discuss like things privately aren't actually private. They're like, they're on Facebook, or they're on systems which are also legislated. It affects sex educators, it affects sex therapists, it affects sex adjacent workers, it affects sexuality advocates, erotic photographers, BDSM community, LGBTQ communities, support groups for survivors of sexual abuse and trauma, support for medical conditions such as
vaginismus and sexual dysfunction stuff. Yeah.
Sex toys, sex aids, gamers, computer games which even contain marginal sexual content are covered by these things. Young adult readers, artists across genres whose work contains representations of nudity, genitalia, and eroticism. You know, I just want to quickly say that, like, you know, Michelangelo's David is being censored on platforms such as Instagram and on TV and on Facebook, you know. Yeah, religious and spirituality based practices which include sexuality within them, like Tantra and Taoism. And you, if you've ever expressed yourself sexually or spoken about sex online, or even in private communications.
So as an individual, oh, sorry, go on.
No, please keep going.
So as individuals, there's a range of things you can do in your day-to-day. So you can pay for your porn, you can acknowledge erotic labor, you can be conscious of your language, your assumptions and implied judgment. You can do your own self-examination around your relationships with sexuality, internalized shame, how your work in the world engages with sexuality, and the ways in which your work can positively shape this contribution. Is the way you engage with the public sexual space congruous with your own beliefs and values? How can you bring that disparity into more alignment? Are there ways that you can help to create more sex positive social sexual spaces online? So these are all individual actions that we can all do to just try and increase this space. But there is absolutely stuff that the government can do to help create this space. So
can we talk a little bit about then how this manifests in actual just proposals that people put up to create either safe spaces for children or alternatively safe spaces for minorities? There are proposals like, for example, age verification, which has not worked terribly well in the UK from what I can gather. Obviously, those kinds of things then involve collecting a lot of data about people, and they may have barriers to people who just simply will not go through the process of doing that verification for various reasons, or might find it difficult because they lack the documentation or other kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about like what the risks are in those kinds of things?
Yeah, so basically with big data, everything is out there in some form or another, and the powers that be, the algorithms have a bit of a profile on us. They know more information about our sexual identity than we probably do about ourselves. So this is having some really specific consequences if we look to, for instance, the United States, where Roe versus Wade is being rolled back. There is quite a threat that these technologies are going to be used to identify women who are seeking an abortion. We can also look to the Optus breach in terms of how this information, it's just out there. It's very hard to control now. In terms of things we can do about it, it's very challenging. I mean, it does come back to personal responsibility, and especially when we're talking about, providing safe spaces for children on the internet, that it is more important that we police children, if we want to use that language, than police adults. There is a wider range of activities that are acceptable to adults than to children. So working more on those, consolidating those spaces and making them age appropriate across different ages as well. So we're not just saying children up to the age of 18 and then suddenly it's hardcore porn, but there's actually a granular approach to building in education and material, artistic material as well, that is appropriate to each level for exploration. I have a bit of a thing about big data that's actually been reinforced really heavily the last couple of days, and I'd love to share it. So yesterday I checked online, and pretty much simultaneously my Stripe account and my Facebook post promoting this event had been removed. So my Stripe account is connected to a separate business where I do therapeutic body work and coaching. I do work with sexuality, but I'm basically dealing with dysfunction, trauma, helping people to learn about different tools and techniques. There's no services involved, but I do use Tantra, which is part of my spiritual makeup as well. It's something, this work is part of my spiritual offering to the world. So it's an established modality, it's legal, I'm practicing my freedom of religion, but I've had my Stripe account removed for adult content. There's no recourse for me in terms of that. So that's a very obvious effect of how there's a lack of access to financial services that is going to have larger implications. The banks are very much involved in this. I also had my Facebook account, Facebook post removed, promoting this, also the launch of a theatre company and some other workshops that I was running. That was removed for sexual solicitation, so that will be a mark against my good name. And
then those two things happened within hours.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh no, the same. It was within moments, basically. So I put a call out to my community online. I said, "Hey, I'm interested in hearing your experiences." And amongst many, I had a tattoo artist who encounters this basically daily, and an academic who works with the erotic gaze, who has had several images that are symbolic representations of genitalia removed. We also encountered many people talking about the Orwellian way we have to use language. We use numerals instead of digits to avoid censorship. We spell sex, S-E-G-G-Z. This is framing our public discourse. This is how we talk about sexuality now in these weird terms to try and evade. When we try and find other spaces, they're getting increasingly shut down. Even spaces that are for adult content, like Pornhub. They're being attacked. So if we can try and protect spaces where this stuff is allowed to exist as well, the actual mechanics of that, I'm not a tech person, but this is a call out to industry, government and tech to think about how to start to integrate this stuff.
I'm surprised that so far we haven't actually had any questions in the chat that I can see. I would have thought that people had opinions on some of these subjects, or at least had some questions. Can I talk a little bit, just get you to talk a little bit more, go back to the thing about things like, I think you mentioned, when you turn 18, all of a sudden, so there's the policing children. But of course, there's a huge gap between the ages of about, 12 to 18, where kids are sort of kids and sort of adults, or at least they're very curious about some of those sorts of things, and particularly some of the more minority groups. Can you just talk a little bit about, when we talk about safe spaces for policing children, how do we deal with that? Because there's lots of situations that I can imagine, and I'm sure you've got actual, detailed knowledge of, that kids disagree quite a lot with what their parents' views of sexuality are. And that's part of becoming an adult, I guess.
Exactly. It's a part of finding your own identity. It's part of it's part of your internal framework of finding consent within yourself as to what's a deep no, what's a deep yes, what shapes, your approach to sexuality for the rest of your life. And one of the great harms that comes about from promoting this view that sex is inherently dangerous to children, that they're going to internalize that. And so when something dangerous and harmful happens to them in sex, they're going to think that's normal, because we've actually hammered that message into their minds with the way we talk about it. Talk about the granularity of that's required to navigate the nuances of children over different ages coming into their own sexuality over time. And there need to be safe spaces where those questions can be addressed, where they can openly have these discussions with peers, where they can allow for the gradual awakening of eroticism and exploration without demonizing it or shaming it, where you can hold both the potential dangers inherent in exploring sexuality, because it can be dangerous. Anytime we engage with the depths of things, there's a danger there, but there's also joy and potential for growth, within a destigmatized exploration of sexuality. And that is under threat. If you look at America and their current drive to censor books for young adults that, have sexual content, have LGBTQ content, all that sort of stuff. There's actually, I think there's been 1,600 titles in the banned book index in the US. 674 of them, which is 41%, explicitly address LGBTQ themes. 357 titles, which is 22%, contain sexual content of varying kinds, positive and negative explorations of that. And just as an aside, 161 titles, which is 10%, have themes related to rights and activism. So you can see a common theme here, where they're trying to shut down exploration and discussion and children to have critical thinking around this stuff. And this goes back to the colonization aspect, in which like the US is allowed to dictate these terms and conditions under which we operate in the internet. Now just imagine having access to books and resources removed in Australia that we didn't agree to, because the US has decided under their own moralistic umbrella that it's no longer appropriate for children to have access. And you know what? It's just safer to not have any access to it at all.
We are lucky in Australia to have, you know, quite a strong and rigorous history around women's rights and around fairly progressive attitudes to sexuality. But witnessing events in the US over the last few years, you know, these things are not guaranteed. The arrow doesn't always move forward. So these are rights that need to be protected. To add on to what Sai was just saying, I mean, there is a level, again, of individual responsibility that we need to come back to, and recognizing individuals in this. So, you know, we're saying what's appropriate for, you know, this 12-year-old versus this 12-year-old can be very different things. You know, it's entirely possible that, you know, one child may have a fairly heteronormative framework, feel fairly comfortable, you know, not have much trauma, you know, be navigating sexuality fairly easily. And it may be possible that other people need more resources because they do have a more, you know, a more
non-heteronormative.
Yeah. So we're talking about the responsibility being on government and corporation to navigate these spaces, but by doing so, we're actually taking those resources out of parents' hands. We're saying that as parents, we don't get to have the access to have, you know, sexual education. We have a new child, so we're quite passionate about this at the moment.
There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll get to. I would just say that, you know, one of the observations I'll make is that one of the reasons the American experience is so difficult for America is that the way that their democratic processes work is very different than Australia. And so you get a lot of extremism because, you know, the effort to, nobody has to vote. And so I think one of the great benefits of having compulsory voting is that everybody has to show up and at least vote out the lunatics. They might not like the people that they get, but everybody at least decides to not do that. But the questions we've got, and I think these are really good questions, because it's easy to kind of throw rocks at American platforms, but of course we do live in Australia. I think one of the questions, one of the comments in the Q&A is that you know, striking the balance between protecting children from material they aren't necessarily ready for and allowing access for adults. No one seems to have the answer. Do you have any proposals for how we might deal with this? Are there things that governments should be? And in fact, the second question here is, how would we set up safe spaces? What in Australia, this is putting aside that these things may not be on Facebook or on a Google platform or whatever it is, are there things that we can do in Australia to cultivate a more open approach to, or sorry, a fairer approach to this? You know, I'm conscious that library, you know, for example, the reason the American school system is so wacky is that it's paid for at a local level. And so the school boards have tremendous power, which they do not have in Australia. So our spaces are quite different. Do you have any ideas for what we could do?
So I guess, you know, firstly, an ongoing commitment to real world spaces to compensate for what's happening online. So to make sure that those resources are available, whether they're online or not, there's some access to them. That is medical stuff, but it's also things like pride events and things that are supported by the government and showing that we want a diverse community. In terms of government, really leading the conversation about balancing these different issues of sovereignty, these different issues of individual sovereignty, state sovereignty, and then how we navigate that as a global conversation. So, you know, really sort of leading the conversation on that rather than letting, I mean, we need to start decolonizing America's hold over this. So that involves other governments stepping up and committing to making safe spaces. It involves corporations and tech companies committing to decolonizing away from America in the way that these policies, these internal American policies that are getting quite intense as America gets more fractured, as these evangelical groups and radical groups have more sway. It's critically important that the rest of the world decolonize away from that.
Yeah, I've got 2 points around that. In that, first of all, there's this weird view that pornographers and people making adult content are leaping out of the shadows to thrust this into the face of your children. That's really not the case. It's actually you actually have to make a choice to access this stuff, right? And there are actually technologies being developed. I've never used them myself, but I've seen things like Bark and stuff like that look like they give the parents a limited amount of monitoring on their children's devices, which pings them if certain things are looked up. There's certain words that appear in their conversations and stuff like that. Now, there's also a conversation to be had around consent, around privacy between parents and children, which I think is really, really important. We should treat them, with respect always. But that does allow for a granularity and choice within each family to decide oh, well, they're looking up this. Let's have a conversation about this. Maybe they're looking up some porn. Cool. Maybe we'll have a chat and see if they understand consent. Maybe we'll see if they understand that this is a filmed piece of entertainment that doesn't contain all of the attributes that a real life consensual sexual interaction would have.
So we got 3 questions, I think, and one of them goes particularly to that issue. And we've only got about 3 minutes, so rapid fire for these ones, and they're quite complicated. But just to follow up your thing there is, somebody has mentioned that, in light of the government's milkshake consent ad, that your points are well made about policy responses. But it's what should young people do within a family or community that does not support their identity or sexuality if they can't access communities of support? Have you seen any research on younger people at risk of grooming or harm where peer support is not available?
This is an incredibly challenging area, isn't it? I don't know that I have any solutions to this. I mean, are you stuck in your family, sexual ideology until you're 18 with no? This is the importance of having, I guess, government supported spaces, spaces that are supported and financially supported by government and really well considered, that have had the resources to do this properly, because that does decrease the chance that somebody is going to find a random guy to teach them this stuff.
Okay, good point. Can I go? Sorry, can I
yeah.
I want to hit the 3 questions. Hit the 3 questions. Sorry. The next one. Sandy actually asked whether you had any human conversations with the platforms that deregistered you. So, have you actually called up Stripe and said, hello, what the, is that possible?
I haven't yet. It's all happened very quickly. I might give that a go this afternoon. I have obviously asked for a review. I've taken that a few steps in, and they've given me no recourse, and also won't give me details of exactly what I have done wrong.
Okay, well,
most of the time there's no actual interaction when these things happen. You just get automated responses, and even if they rescind their decision on Facebook, I have multiple strikes against me, even though they've been rescinded. So every time one of them happens, I get a more and more intense punitive punishment for it. Yeah.
Right. That's going to be really challenging. And look, somebody else has actually asked, and I think this is an interesting point, is that most young people are getting their information from porn sites, and those are not necessarily normative in terms of realistic depictions of sexual activity. And I just go back to the thing from 20 years ago now with the old Avenue Q song. The internet is for porn. It seems that it's slightly less so now, but are there things that we can be doing around educating people better? And if so, does that go back to the safe space argument, or is there something else?
Yeah, so I'd really like to address what it is that we're talking about when we talk about porn, because it includes a diverse array of erotic content. In terms of these algorithmic punishments, it can be almost anything. American activists on the other side of the fence from us are looking at educational material and saying that it's pornography. You know, we do make, you know, this sort of stuff when we're in Canberra, but when we talk about porn publicly, I think we've failed to talk about how wide and diverse this realm is and the educational potential of it. So feminists, queer, disabled, and people of color, you know, these pornographers have worked really hard to decolonize sex and express their identities through this platform. So it can actually be an amazing way itself of finding tools, techniques, community representation, all of those sorts of things. So there's great porn out there. And by getting rid of that, along with everything else, we're actually kind of doing a disservice to our art, culture, and educational resources.
Yeah.
I'm conscious that we're standing in the way of lunch for people, which is always a dangerous thing. Last comments from both of you, and then we'll wrap up.
Look, I think we've somehow managed to fill pretty much in everything. It's a huge amount of information. So yeah, I guess we just want to finish up by saying, how do we create this space? It's for everyone to think about. How do we create a space that is both open and safe across all spectrums, not just sex? It's a particularly gnarly topic, but there's a lot of areas of dissent going on at the moment.
And I just want to say that more education, more discourse is always the best solution for harm minimization. You know, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, it's out there. You know, porn education should be a part of school, like school sex education. It's like, how does it actually happen? What are the actual things that are going on here? What are the negotiations going? What makes like ethical stuff and unethical stuff, you know? And it all boils down to consent and teaching children like an internal consent model. It's about all of us like accessing our own internal consent models before we even do consent with other people. And a shout out to Mistress Tokyo and their mindful consent model here. I just want to throw that in there.
And I'm going to finish up by thanking everybody, thanking you, Rachel, for keeping us moving along, and all the attendees who came to, you know, think about this stuff, and NetThing for holding this space. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Really appreciated it. I think that there are a lot of issues to unpack. I am glad that I live in Australia and not in the United States. So, you know, I think that there is some hope for us to have a more balanced approach. And I wish you both all the best in helping to promote that. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks, Rachel, Eve and Sai. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing really powerful thoughts on what is a complex topic, but